Sam Raimi is one of the finest directors in both the horror genre as well as the superhero genre, but he has directed other films, and today we're here to look at all 15 of the films that he has directed, some which you may even recognize and not realize that he was the director of them. Obviously, the creation of this video ties into his newly released film Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which I didn't really cover in my usual sense with Marvel, but instead I've started a new TikTok account if you want to check that out. I posted my review on there. But without further ado, let's get into my ranking of all 15 Sam Raimi films, starting from the worst and moving up to the best. Although this is a film not many know about, especially the average moviegoer, Crime Wave is one of those films that I will not forget for a long time. Not because it's good, and not just because I found it a bad watch. I had to actually review it. It is purposely embracing the slapstick style of Sam Raimi. At points does produce some laughs, but most of it just feels absolutely chaotic. I know that's the point. You know, I mentioned there are some amusing parts, but after a while, those sort of jokes kind of wear off when it's the same formula applied to different people or scenarios. And not to mention, a real distraction I found was the editing. It was very intentional in the way to show that it's fast-paced and chaotic, but for me it ruined momentum and got very exhausting. I mentioned things got old very quickly, and at first there was some charm to the overacting and commitment from the actors, but as I mentioned, it did wear off very quickly. It is certainly an experience watching this film where you do have a few moments of chuckles, but overall it's very chaotic, very messy, and to be honest, one of the more annoying films I've watched recently.
Get up! Get yourself together!
SpiderMan 3 is a film that I could talk about for ages, and for the sake of this video I'm going to keep it short because, you know, you've heard all the things about Emo Peter before, so I wouldn't be covering any new ground or giving a new opinion as it applies the same for everybody. As I've covered this film in my Spider-Man ranking a few months ago, I do believe that this is still quite a frustrating film to not necessarily review but rank. On one hand, you have details completely abandoning the tone of Raimi's previous two films, and the addition of multiple villains convolutes the whole thing and really does not make sense, to be honest. This is something that I can't apply to many films. In fact, I can't think of any, but the longer this film goes on, the more I enjoy watching it, in the sense that when this film first released, social media was spawning soon after as monks, and naturally came along memes which were brilliant back then. Not that I was on social media that much at that age, but they are still commonly used today. And I think going back and watching this film now, having the knowledge of the memes and the amount of trolling this film has gotten over the years, seeing those moments once again in the real runtime is like a sight for sore eyes. It's quite enjoyable, and I guess it can fall under the category that it's so bad it's good at points, but those bad moments are enjoyable, and you're past the point of watching that and being like grossed out by any of those moments, because to be honest, I'm kind of glad that we got these moments just for the sake of all these memes. While For Love of the Game is not necessarily a bad film at all, it's an example of why I don't think Raimi is suited to romance. On paper, it doesn't feel like his sort of thing, and to his credit, while he doesn't make a bad romance film, it has to be one of the most forgettable. It fits in with all the romantic tropes of these sort of films, and for some reason is nearly 2.5 hours long. The film couldn't decide whether it wants to devote itself to the romantic side of things or the baseball side of things, so you'd get an inconsistent balance where at points you'd have a solid half an hour of sports and no romance at all, and then vice versa. So it was very tough to sit through because it was so awkwardly balanced. The acting was good. As I said, this genre isn't Raimi's strong suit, so it is a forgettable one, which is, to be honest, maybe a compliment to him that he didn't make a dreadful one given his experience with the genre, and he hasn't touched it since. I had a weird experience watching Oz the Great and Powerful, because with a lot of the things they were giving me, I was actually impressed. And when you look at it on paper, it seems to be the perfect return to the Land of Oz as a prequel and in the modern day. You know, it pays homage to it a lot, not to the point where it's too much, but you know, you open up with a smaller aspect ratio in black and white, and once you make it to the Land of Oz, all the colour starts to flourish in. But as a prequel, it expands its world in a believable yet over-the-top way, which does make sense if you think about it, comparing to when The Wizard of Oz came out. It was kind of over the top to look at the time, but that's part of the charm, so it makes sense to have that here. As I mentioned, it pays plenty of respects to that original. However, it really does its own thing and only has sort of Easter eggs for that film, or small details for die-hard fans to notice. And while this all just seems great, for some reason it just doesn't compare to the original, and I think that just comes down to the charm, because I wasn't really feeling that moved here, and everything looked great but didn't have an emotional impact on me. James Franco Franco was the most unlikable lead. You know, I see what they're trying to do with him trying to be this selfish guy who ends up having this redemptive arc, but having him be this selfish guy for the whole entire runtime and then him making one choice to save others does not redeem him at all. It just makes it frustrating as it felt it was earned. So despite this film getting so much right with the looks and respect to the original, I did find myself disappointed as there was that lack of charm and hollowness about it. Drag Me to Hell was Sam Raimi's return to the horror genre for the first time in a while, and while there are flashes of his brilliance in there, I was overall a little bit disappointed. I think that is partially down to the age rating combined with the dark tone, because you'd have this serious vibe about it, but then it can't go too deep into things as it is restricted. And not to mention, with this serious tone, adding only a sprinkle of Sam Raimi quirks in there did make it feel a little bit off and did take you out of the moment a bit. So when you see those sort of things, it's hard whether you're meant to take this film seriously or not, because there is a dark theme, but then you'd get some slapstick moments which you're not sure if you're meant to laugh or just sit there the same. Other than that, this film does everything else pretty well, to be honest. The thing is that the rules and the plot lines of this film are very familiar, but as I mentioned, they are executed well, so I don't have too many problems with that if that's the case. And I genuinely think this has one of the best horror shocks of all time, because unfortunately, even though I did know the ending to this film before I watched it, it still didn't stop me from being blown away by its twist. Unfortunately though, even at this film's strongest, you can be taken out of it with its dodgy special effects for me. I don't hear it talked about that much, but I just found myself being distracted by it. I was actually surprised with Darkman. It's not a film that has been talked about that much, and judging off the rating on IMDb, I wasn't expecting that much, but I found it was a pleasant surprise, especially for the time period it was made. You don't find too many solid superhero films from the 90s, however, I think Darkman is amongst a small crowd that are solid. It still has a lot of imperfections, but for the most part I found it to be a unique film within the genre, something that you can't really say that much for these days. This darker tone of a superhero, well, anti-hero movie was not common at this time at all, except for maybe Batman, which came out 1 year prior to this. Other than that, you had other Batman sequels which were quite campy, as well as all other superhero films at this time, but this did have a dark edge to it and adapted some of the tones and elements that are still in superhero movies to this day, as Sam Raimi did use them in his own SpiderMan trilogy. You can point out the obvious things like the special effects haven't aged that well, as this was over 30 years ago, and we are featuring quite a young Liam Neeson in his career. It's not one of his best performances, to be honest. He doesn't really fully embody the character and feel natural with it. It's actually funny though, because I feel like Bruce Campbell would have thrived in this role, wasn't picked for it, but I do think this is quite an overlooked film in this genre given how much come out since this film's release. The Gift may not be one of Sam Raimi's most memorable films, however it does have some really strong aspects. The combination of the mystery itself with the supernatural elements were fascinating. Combine that with how nobody believed psychic Annie Wilson, who was played very well by Cate Blanchett. It adds that extra layer to the story. We have quite a few familiar faces here, which was fun to see. Never thought I'd see Keanu Reeves as a wife-beating redneck, but that does feel more like a cameo coming from one of the alternate universes in Multiverse of Madness. But what does let this film down is probably its ending, to be honest. Other than that, it was pretty fascinating. I could see other avenues where they could have made this more exciting, maybe have picked up the pace a bit earlier so the end wasn't as rushed and underwhelming, but what did let it down was that the twist seemed too obvious, and you thought, okay, that seems like the obvious pick, but surely they won't go for that. They'll go for a curveball instead, but nope, they went for the obvious pick, and I did find it disappointing. But why I think it is forgotten is the film does lack Sam Raimi's signature, especially of a film of this type, but it is a little bit of a hidden gem, not one that's going to blow you away, not one that you're going to be remembering in a few years' time, but I think it is one that you can take a little look at. The Quick and the Dead is a real homage to those early Western movies, and it features all those tropes for Western fans to love, whether that's from the well-crafted environment or the exaggeration of characters' actions. But this film doesn't rely on those features to satisfy viewers and take up this film's runtime, crafted in a way for them to make sense and for them to play out, whilst combining a good revenge story with it. There are elements which may feel familiar, but the way it's crafted and with the environment and characters, it feels different enough for you not to complain too much. The unfortunate side of things is that the main character, played by Sharon Stone, was not fleshed out completely to the point where you really want her to succeed. Her character is supposed to be closed off, so with that she can kind of fall to the back in terms of performances and strong characters, but one who did stand out was some random kid played by an actor called Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't know, never heard of him before, but he was pretty good, to be honest, and I thought he stole the show with his charisma. I had fun with this film at the end of the day. I think it will please Western fans, but it may not be one that appeals to a wider range audience, as it can be a bit over the top if you don't embrace it. Army of Darkness takes us into uncharted territory in this Evil Dead trilogy, as we finally leave the cabin or the woods surrounding the cabin and go into medieval times. That setting does make this the most unique of the trilogy, in the sense that, you know, it's not set in a cabin in the woods and doesn't play out like the previous two did, but that also leads to the weaker parts of it. Following studio interference, Sam Raimi's signature style of severe gore and violence has pretty much been removed at this point, so you do watch it and feel as though that big presence is missing from it, and replacing those horrific scenes from the previous two Evil Dead films, more slapstick is chucked into the mix, and well, for the most part it is fun to watch it. You look at it and do feel like it is a bit cheap in the sense that it doesn't feel like a proper cohesive movie, and while I don't think it's an amazing movie, it is a fun one, and that fun experience does come down to you as a viewer if you're prepared to embrace it, or if you're just gonna get annoyed by how over the top it is. I was somewhat in between as a fan of the previous two, as we'll talk about later on. Obviously I could embrace it, but only so much, and at points I was getting a little bit frustrated. Bruce Campbell still gives his all for this, and I highly respect it so much. It certainly makes this a lot better than it is because of his commitment to the cause, but it is the weakest of the trilogy, hence why it's this low down the list, but I do understand those who really do enjoy it a lot more than I do. I see that Multiverse of Madness is getting a decent amount of hate online because it didn't please fans in the way that they were hoping, and I can understand that frustration, but to say the whole film was bad because of that, I don't get. Looking at early reviews before I went into this film, I did see a pattern of critics saying that it's not as ambitious as people had anticipated, and once I saw that, I changed my perspective and just focused on a multiversal journey, and that is what I got. I wasn't blown away too much by anything, but as I changed my perspective on what I was expecting, it did satisfy. And one thought that I am developing while actually filming my review now than when I wrote it is that you have to remember that this is a Doctor Strange film and not a Marvel's legacy film, which features all cameos from old characters. They maybe can save that for a future film with multiversal ties, but for now this is a Doctor Strange film, and I think they did a good job in telling his story. However, there is a large portion devoted to Scarlet Witch, and I do understand her turn to the dark side, but I did feel a little bit rushed and at points jumped a few plot holes to get there. This is by far the most violent of the MCU films, and they got the perfect director for it because the amount of insane things that happen here, which I was surprised didn't bump this age rating up to R, was mental, because this film is one of Raimi's most violent on this list, and it has probably the lowest age rating on here. People were expecting this film to be on the scale of No Way Home and massive Marvel movies that have come before. However, it isn't quite that. I can understand their frustrations, but right out the gate, Sam Raimi made me aware why this film was talked about in its own little pocket of the horror genre, because I hadn't seen anything like it, and other than its sequel, I still haven't. It's a fast-paced journey which doesn't really allow for any character development. It just wants to show you some of the creepiest imagery you will see in a film. With a minuscule budget of $350,000, Evil Dead is one of the most successful horror movies and has paved the way for so many films like it and for so many tropes as well. With such a small budget, I actually think that it benefits the viewing, as you can tell how much passion has gone into this project and how it shows some imperfections. I was blown away with how well this film was made with the limitations that Raimi faced, and not to mention I was blown away with his practical effects because they were absolutely terrifying. The mixture of those practical effects with slow motion really did unsettle me, and I've never felt such an experience in a horror film outside of this and the second film, and the makeup was sublime as it helped hammer home those horrific scenes. Having this film above Evil Dead was the hardest choice on this list. As you can see, they are both the same rating. However, I think it is nostalgia that edges it for me with this one, because I grew up with this film like many, and revisiting it after a few years of watching was a special experience. Now, I will say that it hasn't aged as well as I remember, but it is such a unique experience, and my love of the superhero genre is solely down to this film starting it. Spider-Man manages to tell a compelling story without most of the campiness and cheesiness which was expected from comic book movies around the time, and really set the bar for grounded superhero stories and for films that you can take seriously rather than for their small fan group. I mentioned it does have a few campy and cheesy moments, but as it has aged, it just feels fun, you know. With all due respect, as I love the man, Tobey Maguire captures the loser turned hero story perfectly, making it feel like a smooth transition that anybody could go through. As well as a huge standout who's getting a lot of praise these days for his recent return to the character was Willem Dafoe as the Green Goblin, as he was absolutely menacing and scared me in my childhood. The scene of him pretending to be an old woman in the burning down building was the stuff of nightmares that I remember. But the amount of effort and passion that went into this film, not to mention, spawned a genre that I love and single-handedly made me want to be a superhero when I was younger. Spider-Man edges it over Evil Dead for me. Watching Evil Dead 2 without little knowledge of what happened behind the scenes, it feels like a complete retreading of the first film with a few more slapstick elements put into it. But with those small changes come a completely different film. I didn't find myself as terrified anymore. I did find myself laughing a lot more, but I found a nice balance of the two, which made a film which fits into that unique category that I mentioned of Evil Dead, but also makes its own category of horror comedy. It was a roller coaster of emotions watching this film, as at some points you'd be terrified, but then other points you'd be laughing, some points at the same time. I think this is a film which really determines if you like Raimi as a director or what he would do in his ideal project, because it's him down to a T with the slapstick humor and the combination of his horrific imagery. If you can't find yourself embracing this film, you're not fun at parties. It is bigger than its predecessor in terms of budget, and while bigger doesn't always equal better, on this occasion it does, as we improve on the stunt work, acting, and not to mention the most important part for me, practical effects. You will not be bored watching this film, as it's a unique experience and one which had a very surprising yet intriguing end, which has obviously been answered in Army of Darkness. While Spider-Man had revolutionized the comic book genre, I mentioned it still had some small details which wouldn't exactly run in today's genre. However, these are stripped away here. Enter Spider-Man 2, which does everything great about the first one and does it better. It focuses more on Peter Parker himself rather than his ego Spider-Man, but it never feels like you want to spend more time with him, as it is a nice perfect balance of the two. On rewatch, this film is a lot stronger than its predecessor in terms of realism and emotion, as it focuses more on a character-based plot. But one thing that did surprise me is that it's surprisingly funny. Obviously there are some parts which always made me chuckle, but on rewatch there were many moments where I found myself chuckling and being surprised at the humor. So with that quirkiness and strong quality all around, Spider-Man 2 is only my runner-up. Don't worry, I'm as shocked as you are that A Simple Plan is my #1 pick for Sam Raimi's filmography. I will be honest, I hadn't heard of this film before looking into his filmography. When I watched it, I noticed some things which I have heard about referenced in other films. Even then when I started, I was like, okay, I expect this to maybe be a top 5 film. Nothing will top a Spider-Man film on this list for me, but boy was I wrong. I just love the gradual increase of this film. It starts with a simple plan of these 3 people who just discover this large sum of money and agree to split it and not tell anybody about it. It's a real good depiction of obsession, as that slowly increases and turns them all insane and obsessed to the point where they get mixed up in the wrong field. I just love that they were these everyday folks who turn into these untrustworthy leeches and were ready to snake each other at any moment. As great as this film was, the thing which stood out the most for me was Billy Bob Thornton's performance, and it felt so real to me, so down to earth, but at the same time being charming when he needed to be. The story gets to the point where you don't actually know if he will betray Bill Paxton or not, as they are very close, and this film is just executed in such a superb way. I felt like I had no choice but to put it in first place for me in terms of how much I enjoyed it, and it is certainly the surprise of this list for me, and it's probably a surprise for you that it made my first spot. That was my ranking of all 15 Sam Raimi films. There were a few surprises for me personally, but let me know what your ranking is down below so I can compare mine to yours and see what our differences and thoughts are. While you're there, if you could please like and subscribe, it would really mean a lot. And I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I do have a TikTok account, so if you want to follow that, it would be greatly appreciated, as I'm probably going to start posting individual reviews on there, as they're more suited to that than YouTube for me personally. And if you're this type of person, feel free to follow me on LETTERBOXD if you want to see my reviews in more depth and instantly after I watch the films rather than waiting for these videos. There's a very niche fan group on there. But yeah, once again, thank you for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in my next one.